Everybody else, thanks for being here. Entis, thank you for being here with us tonight. It is our monthly art talk. We try to do it on a Thursday, see if it works. So Daze, thanks for being a Thursday guinea pig.
Thanks for having me.
But seriously, folks, thank you for being here with us tonight. My name is Alan Kett. You're at the Museum of Graffiti. We are here with none other than Daze, who's traveled a long way to be with us from New York City. Welcome, Daze.
Thanks for having me.
Give it up
again.
to Daze, please. And so we wanted to bring Daze down here to have a talk with us for a variety of reasons. First of all, because you're you.
Okay, that's enough for me.
You know, and you've contributed so much for so long, culturally, to this graffiti movement, to this art movement, and we appreciate you. So we wanted to have you down for that, and you haven't been here since we opened up the new building, so we wanted you to see it. And of course, it's also Black History Month, and so we wanted to get into a little bit of all these different things in your history.
Okay.
To celebrate you and to celebrate and learn from you. And so one of the things that we say here at the museum, that I say, is that we don't know it all. It's a really huge movement that we're talking about as far as graffiti and style writing goes. And everybody has their own unique experience and their own history. And so we're constantly learning and wanting to know more and more and more. And so just a little bit about you, right? Since I have your bio. So for those of you that don't know much about Daze, Daze, born in '62 in New York City, began his prolific career as part of the second wave of graffiti writers painted New York City subway cars back in '76.
True, mid-'70s.
Right? Mid-'70s. And he attended the High School of Art and Design. So we're gonna do kind of a quick session and kind of just getting from you some of your recollections from that era, from your career, and just kind of have a conversation about it.
Okay, yeah, we'll just flow like that.
We'll just flow like that. So what was New York City like in '76? What was it like to be a young writer back then?
Well, I grew up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, you know, in a neighborhood that was predominantly people from Haiti, the West Indies, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic. That was the kind of diaspora of Crown Heights in the '70s. And I started kind of noticing graffiti on the walls in the neighborhood as a kind of gang type activity, because gangs in the '70s were really prevalent in New York City. But very slowly I realized that it not only had very little to do with street gangs, but it had a lot more to do with a kind of recognition and personal identity. And I had, about 1976, I saw this whole car by a gentleman who's shown here many times, Blade. And I was able to really look at it. It was an incredible whole car where he painted these characters of dancing girls kind of like going across the car. And seeing that really kind of changed my life, because at that moment I realized that this wasn't some kind of random activity, that people were really serious about it. And at the same time, I didn't know if I'd call it art per se, but I knew it was something creative that was being done. So in 1976, I entered the High School of Art and Design, which has always had a history, a very rich history of writers, very famous writers that went there. Some of them were like Lady Pink, Daze, Don Juan, Chino Malo. There were so many people there. Scene, Rupert, he went there. There were just so many. So when I entered the High School of Art and Design, I started meeting some of the people that were going out and painting. And from then on, I just took over my whole life. completely. I went to school, but I didn't really go to school because most of my time wasn't really spent in the classroom. Most of my time was spent with writers, hanging out in the lunchroom and looking at black books and trying to develop styles and, just trying to politic. I mean, this was pre-internet era, so any kind of knowledge that's gained is going to be gained through either a mentorship, an unofficial mentorship, or just through word of mouth. So I was getting a lot of knowledge and I was learning a lot of things that way. Eventually I got kicked out of that school, and but that was fine. I realized kind of early on that I wanted to do something art related. I never really thought about making paintings per se or showing in galleries. The kind of career that I kind of saw myself going into was I thought, well, I'm gonna get a job at Marvel Comics or something like that, because that was a real big deal for me, comics.
So is that how you got into the School of Art and Design to begin with? Was it illustration?
It was illustration, yeah. It was, they asked me to put together a portfolio, but really I just put together several sketchbooks and submitted that, and that was accepted.
So at the time you meet all these writers at A&D, were you also meeting comic book artists or future comic book artists?
Yes.
Okay.
Some of those people were, some of the people that I kind of hung out with in school kind of went on to do comic books and kind of went off in that kind of field.
Not you?
Not me, though, no. I realized that, okay, as I got older, I realized that in order to break into the comic book field, it didn't matter how good you were. It didn't matter at all, because the first job that they were going to give you was sharpening somebody's pencils and emptying out their waste paper basket. So for me, I just couldn't deal with that. I just thought, well, this is crazy. I'm not gonna, it doesn't matter if I'm the next Jack Kirby or whoever. That's how I'm going to start out until somebody realizes that, it's going to put me on within the company. So I didn't go in that direction.
Right, and so then you chose painting. So in '76, from what I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of the people that were in A&D were people like Shadow.
Yeah, Shadow was there, Don Juan, Chino Malo,
SJK, I think.
Bomb One, Al Diaz.
Bomb One. So the reason why I mention these names, folks, and for most of you that might sound really obscure names, you've never heard of them before, but Shadow was Spike Lee's older brother, right? As an example. Bomb One, Al Diaz, that you mentioned, was one half of Samo, which was Jean-Michel Basquiat's graffiti partner, and who actually kind of put him on a bit. And so, although these names are obscure because we don't have these kind of history books in this movement, these are important contributors to the foundation of this movement, but they're not in books. They're in these oral stories through, you sharing that information or me bringing it up. We know these were famous and really important young men at the time pushing a young you maybe forward. Don Juan, so Shadow, by the way, has passed. Don Juan that you mentioned also has passed. So no one really knows much about these people if it's not for the writers themselves that interacted with them, that maybe keeps their names alive and their memories alive through the style of drawing that you may or may not have picked up. So I'm curious, in all those lunchbook sessions, where was the style coming from? Who had the style? How was that happening?
Well, the lettering style, basically we would just pass around each other's black books and look at each other's sketchbooks and see how things were being developed. But I also spent a lot of time just in the subway stations looking at trains go by and trying to somehow absorb that. But it took a long time. It wasn't an overnight thing. There were no books. Writers had collections of their own photos, but they weren't always the best quality. So it was kind of a long process, but as I said, it pretty much took over my whole life. So there wasn't much time for anything else but this, you know. Yeah.
So when did you first go paint a train? Was that in 76?
1976.
And what was that experience like? Where'd you go? How did it go?
How'd it go? It was a fiasco. It was a total fiasco. It was I painted a CC train, and it was in the winter time, so there was already, you know, snow and ice on the ground, and you know, I left school. We painted in the daytime, and we got chased, and I somehow got caught in barbed wire, and my jacket got all ripped up. Yeah, it was kind of nuts, but I was still determined to go back and to kind of do something.
And so in that first sort of phase of your artistic career, your writing career, who were you painting with? What was the crew like? Was it just a ragtag group of people?
At that point, it kind of was. I painted with a guy named Tumad, who was a great partner even before I kind of linked up with Crash. And you know, he had a very short career because he went to the Marines, but he was he's still kind of painting and is still an amazing artist. But primarily, I was hanging out with him. But I painted maybe my second piece with Ritu, who was really active then and is still painting amazing things now. You know, I mean, I was lucky to be able to paint with him, and again, my piece with him was a total fiasco. His piece was great. Mine was like whatever, but just painting with him was a great experience.
So it's amazing, you know, the name Ritu, again, someone a bit obscure in history, but when you speak to people from your generation, or that goes back, Ree was a very important writer. And
big time, yeah. He was great, and he was somebody that was really active on the train. He had a lot of stuff already running, and just kind of linking up with him to go paint was incredible.
So you go from being this young person painting, linking up with these older guys, hanging out in the lunchroom, learning, developing styles. When did you feel like you got it? When did it click for you?
Well, I really started to feel confident. First of all, we should talk a little bit about the medium of spray paint in itself. I think that should be covered so people have an understanding that, you know, back then there were only a few brands: Red Devil, Krylon, Rust-Oleum, and then there were other, a little bit more obscure brands like Wet Look, Wet Paint, Sapelin, all good paint brands to paint with, but the palette of colors that were available was real limited. So you really didn't have a lot of variety to work with. It's not like now we have a Montana and you've got like 10 or 15 kinds of purple to rock, you know. It wasn't like that at all. If you got a can of purple, you were lucky and you coveted that like it was gold, you know, as a matter of fact, and tried to stretch it out. But it wasn't until maybe 1979, 1980 when I started to feel like I really had a grasp on using spray paint effectively, because prior to that, it was still experimental.
And so by that time, you were painting with people like Scheme and Daze, is that right? Close around that time?
Well, I painted with, you know, a lot of different people. I painted with Daze, I painted with The Wiz, Crash, Kel, Cos 207, Repel, a pretty long list of people on the trains. Dondi, Zephyr.
Was that common or was that unusual?
No, it was unusual because, first of all, one guy I should mention that I looked up to was Knock 167. And he was, to me, like this incredible stylist, and his work was so surreal in a way. It was like Salvador Dali of graffiti, you know. He was incredible. And he also was making up a lot of his own characters, and he still does. He's still active. He's still drawing away, drawing incredible things. But I looked up to him, and I looked at his career as a writer, and I noticed that he painted with a lot of different people over the course of his career. You know, he wasn't limited to painting with one crew. And I kind of wanted to be a bit like that too. I wanted to kind of transcend any artificial barriers that might be there, and I wanted to get around. And I looked up at him, and he was doing it.
You're in the movie Star Wars.
Yeah.
So that film was made in, what is it, 81, 82 or something?
81 or 82.
Right?
Yeah.
Right around the time that the book Subway Art was also in development.
Yes. And Wild Style.
And Wild Style. And so you're a triple threat in a sense. You were in all three of those.
And spray can art.
And spray can art. So you became instantly a world-known name.
Well, I mean, you gotta understand, like
celebrity status.
But you gotta understand when those things were happening, we had no idea of the impact that it was gonna have.
Was that why?
Like with Charlie's movie Wild Style, you know, I did that. It was almost like a favor. I was like, okay, Charlie's a cool dude. I guess I'll do this movie, you know, with him. I had no idea. And Henry, you know, I had a long-standing friendship with Henry, and it was almost the same thing. Oh, you're working on a documentary? Oh, okay, cool. Make sure you get some flicks of my cars. We're good, you know. When he put together, and he and Martha Cooper put together spray can art, it was real difficult, from my understanding, to get that book published. And they were turned down by a lot of different publishing companies before they finally find someone to do the book, you know. But I had no idea. I mean, even to this day, it kind of amazes me that, you know, on a global level, this whole culture has really transcended barriers and countries, and has really spread, and that so many people from so many different backgrounds are able to identify with it in some way, in some element of it.
So for you, you know, being a part of all those early things, whether or not, you know, it was a favor or you believed it or not at the time, because it seemed almost unreal because no one else was doing that at the time, but it happened, they got published, it went around the world, you became famous. What did that do for you?
I mean, you know,
girls, women, we like out of painting scene, free
free paint,
nightclub entry, people wanted your paintings. Like, how did it change for you personally?
It never changed me as a person, you know, but I think that it broadened my perspective of the world. You know, because being able to travel, you know, if you're smart, it does change you. You're able to meet people from different cultures, and you're able to kind of build with them and see what they're about. And yeah, I mean, I think that was, to this day, one of the most amazing things for me personally that I was getting out of it. You know, I felt like, you know, going to Europe for the first time, I felt like, wow, am I in a movie? Is this really happening? You know?
So let's just go back a little bit. You know, you experienced this fame through these publications and these films, but before that, you started to exhibit your paintings. How did that come about?
Even before that happened, what was it? In 1980, Futura 2000 and Zephyr kind of curated this studio called the Essie Studios, and it was kind of bankrolled by this guy named Sam Essie, who was a big fan of what he was seeing on the subways. And they set it up. Futura and Zephyr were curating it, and they were stretching and preparing canvases for people to paint, with the idea that maybe one day there'd be an exhibit, a museum exhibit or something. But at that point, the idea was to kind of preserve somehow what was being done on the trains on canvas. So I had never painted a canvas before that at all.
Okay.
The first time I stepped into SE Studios, the first painting that I did, that was my first painting, spray painting on canvas. So it was real interesting to me as an artist that my brain started to click, and I was interested in it as a medium, making paintings, and you know, whether they were in spray paint or acrylic paint or whatever, you know, I just thought, oh, you know, this is something that I want to continue doing even after the workshop is finished. So I started to really slowly develop a little body of work and started to kind of exhibit in group shows. But it was never like an overnight thing, ever. It was always, I always had a kind of a long-term game plan of being in the mix for a long time. And you know, I've always had a really great work ethic, and that's really helped me more than a little. So yeah, things didn't really happen overnight like that. It seemed like that because in New York City in the early '80s was a really exciting moment in New York history, and when you look at the trajectory of what was happening from say 1980 to 1984, there was so much packed into that 4-year period, week by week, that you never wanted to miss out on anything that was going on, whether it was, you know, an opening in a gallery or going to the Roxy every Friday night, or whatever was happening. You wanted to be there and you wanted to be a part of it.
So, you know, you go back to that time, and you know, I think of places like the Mud Club where you exhibited, or you know, the Roxy where many people were painting backdrops, or every week things are changing, or Fashion Moda up in the Bronx as well. It was such an exciting time, as you mentioned. What were some of the standouts for you that you participated? You know, what was the highlights if you could?
Wow, I mean, you know, I think we'd have to have a longer meeting time to go over some of these things.
Was it, you know, the first time you saw this group, or the first show?
Yeah, okay, all right. I remember seeing like Run DMC, you know, they played at this club called Danceteria, and they had this kind of fourth floor where like, you know, up and coming entertainers would perform. It could be, it could be Madonna, somebody like that, but it could be like some performance thing, but you had that kind of freedom. So they played there, and I saw them, and it was like maybe a year later that after their record dropped, they were huge, you know, and they came back to play Danceteria, and it was, this time they played the main floor, and it was just like wall-to-wall people, you know. Seeing that was amazing.
So,
and from then on, it was just.
So you got to see, you know, that the '80s that you're talking about really was that time where there was a mashup of all these different musical movements coming downtown, everybody living, or not living, but experiencing the nightclubs together. But you were there. Were there also art shows happening?
Yeah. So the club scene was intertwined with the gallery scene a bit because. The really cool nightclubs allowed artists to exhibit their work there, and people were curating exhibitions in nightclubs. I mean, I curated shows in clubs, and I participated in a lot of things that were like that, and it seemed like just like another great venue, you know, to exhibit work, you know, and some of it sold, some of it didn't, but it was also a great place. These nightclubs were also great places for artists to kind of meet each other.
So in that time, how old were you in that era? The 20s?
No,
30s?
I was like 19, 20. I was pretty young then.
When did you go from doing those kind of shows to being represented or at like a proper like Midtown gallery?
It was pretty quick, you know. When I say quick, like maybe a couple of years. Like the whole club scene and alternative art space thing for me happened from maybe about 1980 to 83. And by 84, like larger galleries became more interested, larger commercial galleries.
And so by that time you were already a pro at painting canvases or what?
It's hard to, I mean, I was more adept at making paintings, but for me, it was still a journey. I was still experimenting with every painting about what I wanted to do and what I could do.
And where, did you have a studio set up already at the time?
Right, so I think about 1983. At this point, Crash and I were partners. We had painted trains together, and we were very like-minded in what we wanted to do. So we started selling paintings, and he knew of this guy in the neighborhood in the Bronx. He was like a young guy that was in real estate, and we kind of figured, okay, we need like kind of a studio space. We're starting to make some money. Prior to that, we were just painting wherever. I painted on rooftops. I remember Futura had a studio. I went to Lenny's studio, and he'd let me make a few paintings there. That was great, but when Crash and I started to kind of make a little bit of money, that's when we decided to get a studio. And as simple as that sounds, that was the best business decision we ever made. As simple as that sounds, just getting a studio, investing back into yourself, having a place that you could use as your home base, and that, where people could visit you, and, you could realize larger works if you had to. Yeah.
And so you guys started sharing, you guys still share a studio?
We still do.
All right, so you go to Italy. How was it received in Italy?
It was received really well. People were really interested in the whole culture, and they were looking at it from a completely different perspective. Their perspective was that, it wasn't a commercial sort of perspective. It was like, well, these guys are real artists. They're making this real contribution to society. It was completely different. It was very similar, I would think, to maybe what jazz musicians went through in the 1940s. When they went to Europe for the first time to work, and they were welcomed. It wasn't all this stigma about, wow, these guys vandals, what are they doing? Is this really art? What? No. It was great, and then it caught on. It was Italy, people in Germany were interested also, and it just took off.
So was that different? Did you find it to be different from the American perspective?
Completely.
What was the American point of view?
It was more, American point of view was like, how do we use art to sell whatever it is?
So commercialization, money. Yeah,
money. And I would think that that's kind of what the perspective is, In Europe, it's different because I feel that museums are more accessible to the general public. There's no, people aren't afraid to venture inside and to explore. So the artist is looked at as someone that's making a contribution to society. He's not an outcast, he's not this weird person. So because they're brought up with art, and art is something that's accessible to them, they look at it in a different way. Art that might be deemed more controversial is just perceived in a completely different way.
So at the time you started showing these paintings, what was the subject matter of your early works?
Well, the subject matter was always kind of figurative, whether it was scenes or characters. I was always drawing, my own characters and my own stuff anyway, so I would just translate those drawings into paintings. Very early on, my paintings were more like giant pieces, my name, kind of pretty much what I did on the train is what I was doing on canvas in the beginning. But that wasn't really I wasn't really getting the same charge from doing that. So I wanted to change it up. And I wanted to do something that was more challenging to me.
And so, till today, you're continuing to paint, but the subject matter has been consistent. These landscapes, these scenes, these figurative pieces. Is it of people in the community or your community, or how has that changed over time?
Well, most of it really is people from the community, people that I see on the trains, on the bus, I do take photographs, I do work sometimes with photographs that I shoot, but also a lot of it is just subconscious, what I picked up. And it just comes out of that.
And one of the things that I have appreciated in your work in the past is when you pick a sort of subject matter or a place and you create a whole body of work around it, sort of like your Coney Island series or paintings from Brazil. What series? What are you working on now? Are you working on anything similar to that?
I'm working. I don't know if it's a series, but I'm working on paintings that have to do with tunnels, and it sort of takes me back to my experiences as a writer. I spent a lot of time painting in tunnels, subway tunnels, and that whole experience and what it was like, the sounds that I would hear, and the lighting in it, and trying to create something in very little light. But those paintings also kind of are a metaphor for something else, because you could look at it as, the perspective that I'm using, there's always light at the end of the tunnel, so they could be viewed as something kind of optimistic. So that's kind of one series that I'm working on. I'm also doing these paintings that are, again, like crowd scenes of people, and those are just coming straight out of my head. People I've seen and people I've experienced. I'm always working on maybe like 3 or 4 things at the same time, simultaneously.
One of the things that I've noticed in your paintings is that you'll paint kind of anybody, right? You'll paint a white person, a black person, a brown person, kind of anything. But in lots of your paintings, you're painting black inner city people, right? Whether it's the workers or someone on a train station. What is it that, or why is it that you've chosen that subject? Sort of like I think of your train station paintings.
Well, it's a couple of things. One reason is because, as I said, it's people that I see from day to day in my daily journey, and my people, my neighbors, people. But also, there's the other reason is that when you go to a museum, you don't really see people of color represented too often, especially in the history of art. You don't.
So, case 2.
Well, case 2 never really was sought out to be that kind of an artist.
No, I'm just wondering, like, what with so much talent. When I think of that early era, the 70s, the 80s, so much talent that existed painting trains, but they didn't necessarily decide to go into the gallery world. Very few.
No, very few. To be honest, it's a real hard world to navigate through, because you're dealing with, there's a lot of money involved, and you're dealing with a business that's unregulated. It's not like other businesses. So you make decisions. Some of those decisions are bad, and you have to learn from them. It's good to be a bit skeptical of people when they approach you with different projects, and try to think in the long term, is this a good thing? Is this a good thing for you or for other people or what? So it's hard, for most people to kind of take that route.
Right, regardless of who you are.
Regardless, yeah.
And so for you, who's had so much, I guess, you've had longevity. You've been doing this for over 40 years. You continue, right? It's a kind of incredible testament, right? To be able to, not just writing, that adds more to it, but, 40 years, what's been sort of the highlight in those 40 years, if you could say, like, something that you didn't believe that was going to happen as a result of your paintings?
Honestly, it's always peaks and valleys. and to pick out like any one moment is real difficult, I think, because, I've had some great experiences, but being able to travel and to be able to show work in different countries and meet people from different countries, whether it's someplace in Europe or someplace in Brazil or Ecuador or wherever, like, those experiences are incredible for me.
Thank you. So I'd like to open it up to the audience if you guys have questions. You're here. We've got Daze. I can continue to ask questions about this journey, but does anybody have any questions for Daze in the back?
Yeah, just being a fan of the culture, did you ever think that graffiti would take it this far?
No, never. I've never thought that it would go this far, ever. I mean, I always felt like, even though, as I said earlier, it took over my whole life completely, I always thought, well, this is what I'm doing now. I'm young, and, eventually I'm gonna do something else. So it is amazing for me to see that it's really inspired a lot of people.
What did the business side kick in? Like, because I was around back then, and a lot of those guys were talented, but they didn't believe they could make money from that. So, how did you? Because a lot of those cats, they didn't see it. And where did that come from with you?
For me, well, part of it was my work ethic, which I was being creative and I was making work, but I also had like this idea, like I should treat this as a job too, and I should work on this every day, not just when I'm inspired, but I should do something every single day. And that would have been in the very early 80s. I saw people like Jean-Michel Basquiat and how they approached working. I saw people like Keith Haring and what they were doing, and they were just a little bit older than me, and how they were treating their studio practice.
So they were your mentors. Yeah.
They weren't exactly mentors, and they were
role models.
Not that either, but more like an inspiration.
Inspiration. Okay.
Yeah, well, with Keith especially, because I saw the way he gave back to the community too. With Jean-Michel, I saw like, how, in his studio he had like 5 paintings all lined up, and he'd be working on them, like going from one to the other to another, and really thinking about each work and revising it and changing it. And just when you thought like the painting was done, he'd come back and he'd completely redo it, That to me seeing that was amazing, and I realized, okay, this is how you manage your studio practice. This is what it's about.
Did you show at Area?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I saw.
Yeah.
Back in the days at Area.
Daze, somebody from online wants to know what crews you're affiliated with right now.
Right now, I don't know. I mean, I'm down with like Tats Crew, TDS, CYA. There's a lot. Most of them are pretty old.
All right.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary on Prince and how he made like a song a day. And he had like a vault full of like completed songs. Do you have like a vault?
Yes. Yeah, I got a vault.
Like an actual vault?
I got a couple. I'd say I've been around long enough that, and unfortunately, I've seen friends of mine that have passed away, Ram LZ, FaZe, people that were like good friends of mine, A1, and I've seen what's happened to their work after, and I realized that, after you're gone, it's good to have a lot of work somewhere because someone else can work with your estate. With Ram, I went to his storage space. I saw what he had. He had lots of stuff, lots of work that had never even been shown before. And here we are. He's got work here at this museum. He's represented by Jeffrey Deitch Gallery in New York and LA. There's a lot to work with, you know?
Right, he could have a legacy.
His legacy continues posthumously. But if you don't have a lot to work with, then that's a problem.
Yeah, and I think many artists don't consider that. Many artists don't think about that in advance. But I think you thinking about that is the way that your work will live beyond your lifetime, which many people don't actually consider. But when you go to these museums, you'll see work from hundreds or even thousands of years ago in some cases. And these institutions are designed to protect the art and tell the story of the artist and share the work. But not if you don't leave it behind for them to actually do that work.
Yeah, you need to have something to work with.
Yeah.
So another one from Instagram. It's Wonder who asks, at what point after you committed to making a living off your artwork did you start to see success and also financial stability?
Oh, that's a good question. In the beginning, as far as making money from my work, it kind of came off and on. So whatever money that I made, I had to kind of regulate it in a way that enabled me to maintain a studio and to, have a small, very small apartment. But I think it wasn't until maybe 1984 when I started to gain a bit of momentum. However, that story it doesn't really end there, because in New York, at least, the fascination with graffiti was over by 1986. It was over. Like the doors were closed. All those my name's on the guest list, I'm going to this club, wasn't happening anymore. So I was lucky at that point to have had sort of developed an audience in Europe. And because of that, I was able to continue, making it happen.
Hell yeah.
It was,
So there you go for Instagram.
Yeah.
Sell your work in Europe.
well, different markets, as many different markets as you can.
It's a big world. You were mentioning to me that you had recently a solo show in Istanbul.
Istanbul, yeah.
Right? And so it's not just Europe, it's Asia, it's the Middle East.
Where do you think the essence of creation comes from? Because everybody kind of have a similar story, you just start doing something and it turns into something. Where do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a couple of different places. One place could be inspiration. Another place could be this need to communicate to other people how you feel or what you're thinking. Yeah. I don't really wait for inspiration, to be honest. It comes and goes, but I keep going.
It was the hip hop and R&B, Crown Heights affair, so how important was that to you in your inspiration?
Oh, it was so intrinsic to everything that I was doing, there was this soundtrack, like some of those movies from the 70s that I had mentioned earlier. I remember vividly the music from that era easily, and how my friends and I would talk about and anticipate albums that were going to come out, and albums that were already out, songs, and that, and seeing how hip hop developed from something that was a neighborhood thing to the first recordings that you'd hear that were being played in clubs, and then eventually the radio.
Who was some of your favorite musical inspiration back then?
In the 70s, or
when you first really getting in those tunnels at night, and what was your soundtrack? What were you listening to?
Wow. Going out into clubs in the early 80s, you'd hear Africa Bambaataa, but you'd hear groups like ESG, DJs like Larry Levan, and they were becoming cult figures in their own way. There were so many that were coming out. Those are just a couple. The well of inspiration, there's a lot of people in it, and not all of them are museum artists. Some of them are comic book artists. Some of them are poster artists or whatever, you know. I mean, I really feel like, as a kid, I really never, the only museum that I would visit as a kid was the Brooklyn Museum, the Brooklyn Museum. And that's only because it was I lived down the block from it. But I never went into Manhattan as a kid. I hardly ever did. We looked at going into Manhattan. It was like, yo, you're going into the city? You know, it wasn't even called Manhattan. So, yeah, I mean, but I drew a lot from, I got a lot of inspiration from comic books.
My last question, what was your favorite line to hit?
Sorry?
What's your favorite line to hit?
Oh, it would have to be Broadway and the threes, the number ones and threes.
What's the three? Why? It's easy or?
I mean, sometimes it was easy, sometimes it was real hot, but I just saw a lot of great work by people that inspired me being done on those lines.